Welcome to the launch of Youthquake, Why African Demography Should Matter. Thank you to all of you who are joining us in person and virtually. I will be chairing this session. My name is Rachel Masika. I'm a global development consultant and formerly a senior research fellow and lecturer at various universities. This is going to be recorded, so I needed to let you know that at the start of the event. Before I hand over to Edward, who will be talking about his book, I wanted to run through how it's going to work. Edward Paice is going to present some key ideas from his book. Then Emmanuel Osuteye is going to respond. I'm very delighted to be chairing this session because I've read the book, and as a development scholar, I've found the book very insightful, particularly about the different demographic transitions in different African countries and the implications for this in terms of development policy, practice, strategy. I would now like to hand over to Edward, but before that, I'd just like to say a little bit about Edward. Edward is the director of the Africa Research Institute. It's a non-private. Sorry, let's go. It's
non-partisan,
independent research institute that focuses on economic, social, and political issues in Africa. He's an acclaimed author. He's a historian, a scholar from Cambridge, and now I'd like to hand over to Edward.
Thank you, Rachel, very much indeed. And thank you to everyone attending remotely or in person on this World Book Day. And special thanks as well to Michael Walls and to everyone at DPU. I've been attending DPU events for at least a decade, I should think, and I never quite envisaged that I would be invited to address one, and I feel very honoured indeed. And staff here at DPU have always, over the years, until it was mothballed, Africa Research Institute, everyone here at DPU were enormously helpful to us and had a tremendous input into any number of publications. With that, I will kick off. Now, I'm often asked how I came to be writing about this. There was always a strong interest in data and development data, numbers, census figures at Africa Research Institute. And in 2018, somebody showed me a one sheet of paper with what was projected for Africa over the next 30 years. And I have to say that I simply had not grasped what the magnitude of what was underway. And 2018 also happened to be the 50th anniversary of the book that really kicked off what you might call population wars, Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, and the whole idea of overpopulation globally really received a massive boost from this book. Factions divided on either side of the debate as to whether there was overpopulation or not. And so I just thought on the 50th anniversary of that book, I will never, of course, Population Bomb was a massive bestseller. I don't aspire to manage that, but it seemed a good juncture to revisit some of the issues. Now, for anyone not familiar with some of the headline numbers that I was looking at, Africa is quite simply in the middle of what one leading demographer called the greatest demographic upheaval in history. It's not an explosion, as is often said, it's more of a tectonic shift in global demography. As you can see on the Africa line, third column of figures along is the 2050 medium variant projections. Africa will have reached 2.5 billion. That's roughly 25% of the population of the world. And that will have represented growth over a century by a factor of 11. As you can also see, Asia's expansion during the same period is 3.8 times. Now, India, during its period of greatest expansion between 1920 and this year, really, expanded by a factor of 5. So you can see that Africa's sort of acceleration, its surge, is really quite remarkable by comparison with any other world region. One of the things that will shift, which attracts a lot of attention, is that from representing less than 10% of the population in 1950, which is the column on the left-hand side, Africa will have, as I said, come to be a quarter of the world's population. Europe, on the other hand, from being, and I'm speaking of Greater Europe, so including Russia, will have moved from being about 20% of the world population to about 7%. So you have a really, this seemed to me at the time, and still does, to be a really huge development for all of us. Now, a word on the projections that you see here. Whatever its detractors may say, the United Nations Population Division has proved, their projections have proved pretty good over 2 to 3 decades, especially for the global totals. Greater variance on regional totals and continental totals, and sometimes with country projections, quite big misses over that sort of time length. And that principally has to do with the difficulty of projecting fertility rates in high fertility countries that suddenly move into a fertility transition and fertility starts to fall. Now, if we look at the global figure for the world's population in 2050, that's 9.7 billion. About 2/3 of that projection is what's sometimes called baked in. That means that because of current reproductive habits around the world and the current age structure, that about 2/3 of that figure is almost certain, and that's rising by the day. Put another way, there's a 95% probability is assigned by the United Nations Population Division to the figure being between 9.4 and 10.1 billion. Now, this all hints, considering the projections, this is not just getting lost in the figures, it hints at one of the key uses in development and so forth of demographic projections in any scenario building, because they tend to be a great deal more accurate than, for example, economic forecasting, and certainly immeasurably more accurate than weather forecasting in the UK, for example, or even globally. Now, in 2050, at that point where Africa has reached somewhere around 2.5 billion, the continent will have generated 65% of the growth between today, 2020, and that time in 30 years' time. And it will still be growing pretty strongly. The rate of growth in 2050, and especially the rate of growth in a number of individual countries in the continent, will then largely determine whether or not global population growth will continue for the rest of the century, or whether it will peak before the end of the century. That is a very contentious issue that almost leads to furniture being thrown between people of different mindsets on that issue. Now, within the Africa total, don't worry about reading the whole thing. It's just to give you an idea. Look at the column on the right. Within Africa, there are 9 countries whose populations between 1950 and 2050 will have expanded by 15 times or more. Now, if you remember, in the last slide, we had Africa as a whole expanding by nearly 11 times. So these are the ones among the more populous countries that are even that are substantially outpacing that. Niger is the winner with 25 times expansion over that period. Côte d'Ivoire not far behind. Uganda, Angola, Tanzania and Zambia all expanding 17 times. But one of the reasons for showing this is just to introduce the concept here that individual countries are very different. You know, they may all these ones may be growing by the same, roughly same order of magnitude, but we must bear in mind that the demography of each country is different. Now, the composition of these individual populations is also extremely relevant. The median age across the continent is less than 20 years old. In some of these countries, Uganda, let's take an example, the median age is closer to 16 years. And across the continent, the average, on average, 60% of the population is under the age of 25. So this is the extraordinary youthfulness of the African continent. So that was the first reason for writing the book for me, sheer fascination with the overall numbers and with the differences of growth and characteristics of the different countries. And the title, Youthquake, is really alluding not only to the youth of the population, but to the fact that what is going on is not an explosion. It hasn't just suddenly happened. It is a seismic shift over a very long period. Secondly, although the headline numbers that we've seen were quoted occasionally in Western media reports, usually attached to adjectives like superb or explosive or disastrous, discussion about the details of Africa's demography there in the media and in many other quarters, the world of investment, for example, seemed to me to not only usually be rather binary, but also more absent than present. Actually, I mean, even in academia, one could very easily, I'm sure we've all attended two-day conferences, fascinating papers on a huge range of African studies topics or development topics, but you'll see not one paper about demography. That seems to me extraordinary. Even at scholarly migration conferences, I mean, I've attended a fair few. Migration, after all, being one of the components of demography, the migration, births and deaths, and you will again have absolutely fascinating studies of migratory behaviour in the Horn of Africa or in the Sahel or whatever, but nothing. And you may have mentions of population pressures, but there will be no detailed analysis of the neighbourly, as it were, region by region fertility and mortality trends. And then we're all used to reading dissections of coming elections and what's going to happen in the election, and yet nothing about demography. Now, if we take Kenya, for example, a country of ever-shifting political alliances, like many others, and with an election this year, there's an acute awareness within the country of numbers. For example, in Central Province, in what some would call Kikuyu heartland, the fertility rate now is down to about 2.5 births per woman. Out in the northeast, the Somali population has a total fertility rate of 7. And in the west, the lake populations, most of them have a total fertility rate somewhere around 5 or 6 births. Now, these things matter in political terms because at the end of the day, they mean numbers. So there was, I felt demography, and certainly in the world I'd inhabited, seemed to be rather absent as often as not. Now, third reason, it seemed obvious to me from the outset that these figures mattered more and had potentially greater consequences than was generally appreciated, whether inside or outside the continent. I mean, for example, in the context of population shrinkage in so-called developed economies, which is all the rage at the moment, you will see plenty of that in the paper. But okay, you've got that shrinkage, but this means that by 2050, 40% of the children being born worldwide will be born in Africa. The continent will be home to 1/3 of the world's youth. That's an age designation between 15 and 24 years old. And even by 2035, the continent will have a larger workforce than India or China. So that's just the numbers. And I'm sort of inviting everyone to think within their own spheres of study or practice about the implications for them. Now, if I can just move on, a quick word about the approach and the structure. I put this map right up front in the book because in the context of inviting people to sort of to think and stretch and introduce demography, it seemed to me that lack of awareness of demography was an almost precise mirror of our lack of awareness of the geography, the basic physical geography of this extraordinarily large continent. I mean, it is 1/5 of the world's landmass. You do not pick this up from a classic flat map. I mean, I chuckled opening a copy of The Week, one of my favourite journals, just the other day, and seeing, once this is under your skin, you will never forget it, this sort of thing. I'm sorry, I apologise to those of you already familiar with it, but the first time I saw one of these, I just thought this is extraordinary. So there you have continental United States, China, India, Europe, and Japan all fitting comfortably inside the borders of Africa. And, this is an important thing to remember. Algeria, in North Africa, DRC, down here on the eastern and central side, each 4 times the size of metropolitan France. These are big countries. So, like this map, the book was intended to challenge preconceptions, received wisdom, and generalizations. And really, as I was saying, to prompt some reimagining of futures in Africa in particular. One reviewer of the book wrote, nuance runs through Youthquake like a word through a stick of rock. And I'm rather pleased about that because I was seeking to write the antithesis of a generalizing book. So, in sum, I thought there was an opportunity to write a non-sensationalist, neutral investigation of the trends and the dominant narratives about those trends and the history of population politics regarding Africa. So to provide a sort of handbook for anyone interested in the past, present and future of the continent. I hope at this stage that it goes without saying that the outcomes, the impact of demography is, of course, of greatest importance to the citizens of the continent rather than to outsiders. With that in mind, wherever possible, I've related African perspectives on issues raised. The book begins with a pretty, I think, unusual virtual debate about Kenya's population growth and whether there is, to quote, greatness in numbers. This debate between Kwame Owino, director of the Institute of Economic Affairs, writing in The Nation in Kenya, and Jimmy Wanjigi giving a sermon at his local church, Wanjigi being an entrepreneur stroke political mover. Very early on in the book, I also dissect President Museveni's 2018 speech to the nation, asserting that Africa is underpopulated. And I use that to introduce the history of resistance, stern resistance, from within the continent to Western prescriptions on population growth. Then throughout the book, you will find the views of famous intellectuals, Sheikh Anta Diop, Mwesiga Barigo, Mahmoud Mamdani, Thandika Mukandawiri, all feature, especially when the historical backdrop to this battle over population growth is described, which really started with Ehrlich's book in the late 1960s, went through the mounting challenges faced by the continent during the 1970s, into the lost decade, so-called, of the 1980s, the imposition of World Bank and IMF structural adjustment policies, and so on to the present day. And in the chapters on jobs, the sections on the predicament of youth protest and commentary on contemporary politics, the voices that I've used are almost exclusively those of African experts and participants, and that was quite deliberate. Now, a word on the some primary source work, because I think that's always of interest to anyone studying anything. Obviously, the United Nations Population Division, material is the kind of the primary source, and here you will see the projections for the regions of Africa from their 1996 publication and what they were forecasting for 2020 and what the actual figure came out at. So Africa in 1996, UNPD was projecting as its middle of the road projection 317 million, and it came out 1341, so actually very close to the continent. The one for Western Africa is quite astonishing. The 402 million came out absolutely bang on. But I must hesitate to say, that I've specifically chosen a date here because after 1996, there was a thought, a growing feeling that Africa, or many African countries, had commenced a fertility transition. And therefore that fertility was starting to fall fast, or reasonably fast. There was also, of course, the scourge of HIV/AIDS, which it was feared was going to have a major effect on mortality. And so after 1996, projections started to be reined back. But then, if we look what happened, in the left-hand column you've got the 2008 revision, and the projection for 2050 in that revision. So, for example, Algeria at the top, UNPD was projecting 50 million. Now, the medium variant projection for Algeria today is now 61 million. So it's 22% higher. And if we come all the way down to the end, can you see all Africa, bottom right? The projections, the median projections for 2050 have been raised by 25% since 2008. New revision coming this year, end of May or June, going to be very interesting to see. Although there will be no major change in the total figures for the continent or probably for most of its regions, but there will have been some swings and roundabouts for the individual countries. So that was one thing I was particularly interested in, was looking at how the figures had varied over time, why they'd varied, when they were more right than wrong, so forth. Now, in the 2008 projections, not only do we have that overall rise for the continent, but half of the 37 countries with a population above 5 million had already equaled their projections for 2025 by today, by 2020. So this shows the extent to which things were cantering ahead. Galloping is the phrase President Museveni uses. We're galloping. Yet still in some quarters, there are assertions that rapid falls in fertility are universally underway on the African continent. It's astonishing that these things still get said. And I must add at this point just that, that the expected growth is not only higher in some of the high fertility countries, but also in those well into their fertility transition. Egypt is a classic example where the fertility rate came down to about 3 births per woman and then stopped dead. And then started to rise. Now, what would classically happen in a transition is that from 3, it would have started nudging towards what's called replacement level, somewhere between 2.1 births to 2.5 births. But it's risen. And, demographers there's some very interesting theories as to why that's happened, but it is of intense concern to the Egyptian government, because all of a sudden, hoping that their population was stabilising in the first half of the century, they're now looking at continuing growth. Now, the other thing, in addition to the UNPD material, the other key primary resource that I became extraordinarily familiar with is, and if we could have the next slide, demographic and health surveys. Now, these are, for anyone not familiar with these, and I'm ashamed to say that I wasn't familiar before I started work on the book, but I expect everyone at DPU is familiar with them. Demographic and health surveys are an extraordinary resource and some of the best data for Africa alongside censuses. Since 1984, the DHS programme has undertaken more than 400 surveys. It was a successor to a survey programme called World Fertility Surveys. And over half of those 400 surveys have been in African countries. And they're carried out by an organisation based in America called ICF and National Bureaus of Statistics. Now, some of the key features of DHS surveys are that they have very big weighted samples to give truly representative national surveys, representative by income quintile, by region, by education, qualifications and so forth. I mean, for example, in Nigeria, 42,000 households complete questionnaires. That's a big survey by any standards anywhere in the world. And there's a sophistication to the way they're carried out and a breadth that, of course, make these surveys the go-to source for demographers. These are the questions, the key questions that are in the woman's questionnaire. Obviously, the reproductive questions are not replicated in the man's questionnaire. They're questioned separately. They're questioned in the language they choose to be questioned in. And this just produces, an extraordinary mine of information, of use to anyone in development. I'm sure Rachel looks at these things every month. But they're absolutely the bedrock of demographers' projections as well. They're the base material, in a sense, along with censuses. So if we can look at I won't go into too much detail here, but here, for example, is data on literacy for women in Nigeria. You can see that it's broken down by age group, by zone, and actually below here it's broken down by state as well, also by wealth quintile. I've pasted in. So if we look at the wealth quintile here, bottom left, you'll see that of the highest wealth quintile, the wealthiest among wealthiest women in Nigeria, 34% have had more than secondary schooling. And conversely, or similarly, going up you will find that, let's just carry on, the figure reasonably, and there at the bottom right you will see 41,821 women questioned. So that's the size of the sample. If we just have the next one, does the same thing for men, broken down. So this is really an extraordinary mine of information. It covers all sorts of things, from access to water to etc., etc. And I use these, if we could move on to the next one, to to stress test the Unpd projections for 12 countries, which I call in the book the doubling dozen. They're all double their populations between now and 2050. They're all growing by 3% per annum or more, with the exception of Nigeria, which I included because of its sheer size, the largest population in Africa, and it is growing at 2.6%, so not far off 3. So these countries account for 45% of the current population, and they will add, or are projected to add, 650 million people. It's nearly the size of Greater Europe now, by 2050, 55% of the continent's total growth. Now, what I was really looking at here, apart from anything else, and there were a number of other ways of stress testing it, but if we look at Niger at the top, go along to the third column from the right, you will see that Niger's total fertility rate has fallen since 1990 by less than one birth, 0.8. So it was 7.8 births on average in 1990 to 95. It's now 7. The assumed fertility rate in 2045-50 is in the next column to the right, 4.3 births. So Niger, the point here is Niger has not actually reduced fertility by one birth in the last 30 years, and in the next 30 years, the Unpd median projection is anticipating it will fall by nearly 3 births. Now, these guys are expert. Yeah, I just had to say that. But at the moment, because nothing's happening to the fertility rate, it's quite a push to get there. And for some of these countries, reaching the Unpd median projection should be fairly straightforward. I mean, look at Zambia, second just up from Nigeria. The fertility rate there has fallen by 1.6 births in the last 30 years, and they're being required, inverted commas, to fall by another 2 births by 2050. Could be possible for all sorts of other reasons that are not behind the figures and not on this slide. So that is a subject that I was really interested. Now, taking into account all this other developmental data that is in the DHS surveys, it's possible to conclude there's no change in fertility going on at all at the moment of these countries in Niger, DRC, Mali and Chad. The outlook is unclear in Mozambique and Burkina as to whether a real fertility decline has started or not. In Angola, Tanzania and Nigeria, there's a slow decline. I mean, Nigeria at the bottom, 1 birth lower in 2020 than 1990. That's not a full-blown transition. I mean, technically it is, but it's a slow one. And in Zambia, Burundi and Uganda, there are full-blown transitions underway. So fertility very much on downward path. Now, the sort of thing, if we look at the next slide, the sort of thing one is, I will canter on as fast as I can. I think I've got 5 minutes or so. Right?
Yes.
This is some of the sort of background stuff. Women are at the centre of this. Let's not lose sight of this. We're talking about reproduction and all sorts of slightly impersonal words. We're talking about women here. And the lives of women and women's empowerment indicators are central to what is happening now and is going to happen. And one of the things you can divine from DHS is the extent to which women are able to participate in decision-making in the household. And so here, let's take a different country. Let's take Angola. Follow the columns along. 75% of these women questioned, and I can't remember the size of the sample in Angola, but 15, 20,000, something like that. 75% can make decisions to do with their own health care, 81%, major household decisions, and so forth. On the right-hand column, only 7% can't make any of these decisions. Their husbands make them for them. So, in terms of women's empowerment, this is quite a positive set of indicators for Angola. On the other hand, if we go to Mali, a little below that, 63% of women cannot make any of those decisions independently. So this, as I say, just one, I don't think we've got time, so we'll go on through the next one. But another really important issue is the prevalence of violence against women, which, as you will all know, that's fine if we leave it there, is a very big issue. And a decline in the use of violence for things like refusing sexual relations or spoiling the cooking or being cross with the children. When the use of violence starts to decline, it's very often in tandem with a fertility decline. It implies that women are having slightly more authority and more control in the household and in household decisions. But the violence statistics we'll miss out in the interest of time. So moving on to some other emphases just before I round up. There's an emphasis throughout the book on heterogeneity. I've mentioned it already. There is no Africa demography. And these fertility maps on the left of Mozambique, on the right Nigeria, just tell the story. Totally different fertility rates in different parts of the country. Interestingly enough, a lot of the stereotypical things one hears sort of don't apply. And I'll come on to this, but there are very high fertility rates in Christian, predominantly Christian states. In Nigeria, for example, it's not only in the Muslim north that there is very high fertility. And you look at any of these maps in a DHS, and they just sort of tell you a story. I would have to say there's quite an interesting overlay with poverty rates here. There is quite significant correlation everywhere through the continent of high fertility and high rates of extreme poverty. As to which causes which, that's perhaps a subject for another day or a question. So I emphasise the heterogeneity, and the rapid growth is concentrated in Eastern Africa, Western Africa, and what Unpd describes as Middle Africa or Central Africa. In the same sort of vein, overarching explanations are pretty much, without exception, incomplete. So, be really wary when you hear, it's this that brings about a fertility transition. At best, these sort of sole explanations are plain wrong. I'll give you an example. It is often said that Urbanisation is key to lowering fertility rates. And the city almost invariably quoted in Africa is Addis Ababa, where the Ethiopian capital, where the fertility rate is under 2 births per woman. Well, this was cited by the late great Hans Rosling, Addis Ababa was, as being evidence as to why Africa was already emulating what Asia did in terms of fertility transition. I'm afraid to say that was not a great example to use, because Addis Ababa's fertility rate is exceptional not just within Ethiopia but within Africa. There are very specific reasons why the fertility rate is less than 2. And again, somebody may want to ask about that, but I won't go into them now. Similarly, there were 32 million people living in urban centres in 1970 in the continent, in sub-Saharan Africa, actually this figure for. Today we're at 40% of the population, and yet the fertility rate across the whole piece has only fallen by 2 births to 4.7 births on average for the region. So, I mean, sure, urbanisation is rising, sure, fertility is slowing, but urbanisation is not driving a fertility transition comparable to any of the other regions of the world. In the interest of time, I'll scoot on. It's the same with any of these all-embracing middle classes. Well, middle-class women have fewer children automatically. So as the middle classes rise, fewer children. Well, actually, in the richest quintile in Nigeria, women choose to have 4.5 children. In DRC, the richest women in the richest quintile have almost 6 births. So, none of these standalone explanations hold water. Finally, I do a bit of pointing out of rogues. There are quite a number of books out there where people make up their own figures. Investment bankers are good at this. For one, my crown goes to a man who crowned himself the Rogue Demographer in 2012, who put it out there, got coverage in all the papers around the world, Wall Street Journal, Economist, you name it, for saying that globally fertility would fall to replacement, 2.1 births, by 2025. He said this in 2012. It was literally impossible. I mean, literally impossible. And yet, he's been quoted ever since. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. There's a very famous climate strategist at Cambridge University, Scandinavian gentleman, who says that the population of the world will peak by 2040 at 8.1 billion. Well, he's not looking too good, because next year it's hitting 8 billion. So, unless he knows something we don't about what stops global population dead like a tanker being sunk, there we are. Now, 3 minutes, if I may, on reflections. Nearly there. I've done 40 minutes, haven't I? Sorry to overrun. I'll be quick here, because there's, in a way, not much to say about the conclusions, because I wanted the reader to draw their own conclusions. Yeah. Demography, what I wanted to highlight was that demography is a crucial factor to be taken into consideration when contemplating scenarios, or even a prism, but it's not a crystal ball. And so, I can't say how, what the consequences are. I won't say what I think the consequences are going to be. And it certainly wasn't my intention to be in any way prescriptive about population growth on the continent. African countries have been told to curb population growth for the best part of half a century, and personally, by people in the West, I don't feel terribly comfortable with that. And after all, as I put in the book, in the longue durée, everyone comes from Africa. So, we need to have a slightly greater imagination about this issue, I think. Fortunately, my publisher didn't insist on a sensational end, that Africa was going to sink beneath the waves or something. And I'm very grateful to Head of Zeus for the joint care that they took over the final 2 chapters, where I do make some reflections, and I won't go into them now because perhaps we can make
time.
And all I would say, the last slide, it's about having an open mind. This, and I'd like to go back to that map again, because regarding the alarmism about population growth, I understand there are stresses of rapid population growth, etc. But the outright population growth alarmism, I think we need to be the doomstering. We need to be quite careful about. In 1968, there was a very prominent publication in the States that looked forward 50 years. It's the same year as Ehrlich's population bomb came out. You wouldn't believe the rubbish in this publication when we look back at it now. So we need an open mind about the future. Similarly, one of my great heroes, Ha-Joon Chang at Cambridge, has pointed out that that there's no negative thing thrown at Africa that wasn't thrown at his country, South Korea, in the 60s and 70s. And look where South Korea is now. And he is one person who finds it objectionable that Africa, to quote him, seems to be treated as if it's on permanent disability benefit. Likewise, the final one, Gunnar Myrdal. Some of you will know of him, Nobel economist, writing Asian Century, again at the end of the 60s, just wrote off the whole of Asia. And now, look where we are with that. So I encourage all readers to use demography, but not to decide that either it is the stuff of miracles or the stuff of disaster. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Edward, for providing the highlights of a very detailed demographic analysis, making the case for demography in looking at development issues. As you started off by saying that it's not considered in great depth in development literature and conferences, and then you've made the case by showing the projections of Africa and how historically some of them have been wrong. And then going on to also talk about some of the relationships with wealth and fertility transitions and education, and where there's actually not a relationship, and how the situation is really diverse and not a one size all. Before I pass on to Emmanuel to respond, I'd like to let those who are joining us virtually that there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions and discuss what Edward has talked about. So at that point, we will invite you to either raise your hand or you can start putting questions into the question and answer function. Now, I'd like to introduce Emmanuel Osuteye. He's a lecturer and researcher at the Development Planning Unit, and he will be responding to Edward's highlights and themes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Edward. I think I have quite a tall order. And in true African format, when we're given 15 minutes, we take an hour. So brace yourself. And it's a lovely book, 400 pages long. Thank you. But I think I've had quite an interesting couple of days, digging into it. And in all honesty, I think as fate would have it, I picked it up in the last couple of days and I couldn't put it down. It was very gripping, very engrossing. So I'm going to say 2 blocks of comments. And I think that actually comments and the reflections and my hope is that the latter part will kind of like open up for discussion and questions also. And I think the book does a fantastic job of using demography, data, to talk about the social, the political, the economic, and the environmental dimensions of development in Africa, and of course the subgroups on health, education, etc. And my general reactions are, I would like to say, are these. So 3 things the book is, and 3 things it's not. So 1, I think that the book is exciting. I think that it is very Africa-centric, and it's full of great facts and great data. It's very data-rich, but not data-heavy. And it's written in a way that makes it very easily accessible and easy to follow and easy to digest. And I think that it's a great introduction to Africa for anyone, whether you're a demographer, whether you're a social planner, wherever your background is. It's a great introduction to the continent as a whole. I think that the exciting fact, I mean, I couldn't get put away the statistics on how by 2050, that century between 1950 to 2050, the population of Africa would have multiplied by 10-fold. It sticks with you. These headlines stick with you. And 60% of that population would be less than 25 years old. It sticks with you. Ivory Coast, which is next to my home country, Ghana, would have multiplied its population by 15 times. Niger, quite close to Ghana as well, would have multiplied by a whopping 25 times. Actually, 9 countries in Africa would have multiplied by 15 times. This is incredible. East Africa, West Africa, as a unit, will be larger than the whole of Europe if you were to take the absolute populations. This kind of data really sticks with you, and I'm going to be using some of these in as you can see, I've memorized them already, and it's going to become useful in my presentations and my conferences. They will sound very spiced up, and Edward hasn't paid me for this review, I must add it there. If it sounds overly positive, it's all mine. The second thing that the book is, I think, is that it's balanced. I think that it's bold, it's balanced, and also very detailed. I think that you have moved not just from the headlines, but you're given a lot of nuanced but important detail. You know, that last graph, that table that showed the variations in projections and how these projections are falling or failing to fall in line, I found that to be quite interesting. I think it's also bold because it confronts some very established narratives about Africa that need confrontation. And it does so in a very nuanced way to shift from this gloom and doom image that often it's painted with a continent. Unfortunately, even in today's 21st century, Africa still bears the tag as a conflict-ridden or malnourished, impoverished. Every Christmas, I loathe to walk in the shops, not because I don't have money, but I don't like the song by Band Aid that says, do they know it's Christmas time at all? A couple of sentences that seeks to always worry me is that it's a bitter, it says that where there is cold outside your window, and there is a world of dread and fear, where the only water flowing is the bitter sting of tears. And I'm sure you know it. It's a well tonight, thank God it's them and not you. And there won't be snow in Africa, of course not, this Christmas time. And the greatest gift they will get is life. Where nothing ever grows and no rain or river ever flows, do they know it's Christmas? Not to pick on them, but I think that this imagery, this cultural imagery still persists. And this book seeks to challenge it without being political. And I was kind of intrigued at how it remains quite balanced, but yet does this job quite well. I think that the title, Quake, really stuck with me. And it's not really a boom or explosion or something quite dramatic that could have acted. But in a nuanced way, the quake is dramatic. It starts with a tremor. It has an epicenter, but actually it shakes quite through that Africa's population is growing. I also think that it points some historical relevance to some of the demographic data and details that are pointed out in the book by Edward. And I think that is very important. I'll read for you a quotation from page 65. Which stayed with me. A quotation by Adebayo Adodeji, who was then the head of ECA, United Nations ECA, in the early 80s. So this is a 40-year-old quotation. But 40 years ago, listen to it as if it is the current head, Vera, who's now the current head, and is reading it today. So 40 years ago, he says that this is some of the undertones of Africa's impoverishment. He says that given the perverse international financial and monetary arrangements, increasing domination of the developed countries through, amongst others, transnational cooperation, monopolistic technology markets, and stagnant or declining prices in raw material exports from the developing countries, whilst prices of manufactured imports from developed countries are continually increasing. It was extremely difficult, or if you want to role play that imagery, it extremely difficult for Africa to get the equality it deserves. It stood out to me that 40 years ago, this quotation was true as far as he's concerned, and it remains true and open to debate, depending on which side of the coin that you are. But think about it. That, for me, is a very interesting feature of the book, that it provides some historical, some contextual underlying drivers of the manifested data and statistics. Lastly, the third of what the book is that this book presents a clear trend line. I think that it is a matter-of-fact kind of presentation that Africa's population is growing. There is a simple message woven through all the chapters, irrespective of the theme, irrespective of the focus, irrespective of the nuances. The trend line is simple. Africa's population is growing. Demography matters. Africa is not a country. It is massive, and it will get more massive. 1 in 4 by 2050 will be African. And I'm glad to see that this panel has taken the lead. There's two of us here, and we're in 2000 right now. So this is a matter of fact, and this is what this book does. Picking the very important issue of demography and stringing this beautiful message all through. 3 things it's not. I think that this book is not deterministic. Having praised its matter of fact, balanced and detailed nature, it's not forecasting consequences of the future of Africa, but rather places Africa carefully at the center of all the debates and all the arguments that are being made. It is a way in which it points to the use of African information and African data and African knowledge in an age where we are crying for the decolonization of knowledge and the decolonization of literature. I think this book presents a very important reading list for academics and for practitioners alike. There are several quotations of African academics scattered through every single chapter of the book, and I found that to be an incredibly reassuring feature. I think that, again, it is not a book that manufactures solutions, which sometimes books that seem to tend to talk about development challenges in Africa tend to do. The book is not manufacturing solutions, but it is rather responding in depth toward the awareness of Africa's development challenges, or the use of its demographic projections, and opening that up to discussion, debate, and for policy relevance. And I think that is a very important. I wish that everybody who's a senior policymaker would read it and begin to make the conclusions for themselves. I'm glad that Edward ended his presentation on that note, because I thought that this is a book where you jump into a journey with the author, but leaves enough room for you to make your own conclusions at the very end. Finally, this book is not an end of the conversation. And just like what I've said, that the conclusion is up to you, but rather the very beginning of it. And I think that this is a very important moment for us all to jump into. So to conclude and to open up conversation, discussions, and questions, I think that there are important reflections for us to make on Africa's political future, thinking about the importance of demography and the centrality of demography. How is there this knowledge of a growing continent, a dominant world force now and also in the future to come, going to change the posture, the position, the image of Africa? And how would there be a leadership change in Africa? How can a very young continent have such an aging leadership? There was an article a few years ago in 2015 reflecting on the mean age of the 10 oldest leaders in Africa. And your guess is as good as mine. They should be in pension and retirement, but then they are in active service. So how does this reflect, and what are the opportunities for political leadership and political changes, knowing that Africa is a very young and youthful continent? The book begins to open up the second dimension of the quake, actually, that a Youthquake, youthful engagement, youthful protest, and political participation is very important. There are some changes that are beginning to happen, albeit with a lot of resistance. You can think of Uganda, you can think of Ghana, you can think of Zimbabwe, all with very youthful leaders. Actually, this week, the UNEP has hosted a youth assembly where it's actually bringing young voices to reflect. At the COP26, there was a deliberate attempt to try and bring youthful voices, albeit with a lot more room for improvement. The AU has appointed a youth commissioner. To what extent is that tick boxing, and to what extent will that actually engender proper debate of a continent that is incredibly youthful and will continue to be youthful? I think that may shift to 60 years ago, where the founding fathers of the political liberation movements across the continent were actually quite youthful by the demographic definition of the AU's use of youth is up to 34. You think of Thomas Sankara, if you think about Patrice Lumumba, all these will fall into the youthful brackets. But in today's modern world, we would have no space for political leadership if you think about themselves. I'm just about over that age, so I think I can speak for the youth. I think there is an interesting quote I wanted to also pull there. I mean, page 323. Where it talks about the challenges of the youth. He said, young people feel marginalized, frustrated, disillusioned, robbed of hope, angry, and sometimes at the point of violence. They are full of potential, dynamic, ambitious, inventive, conquering, but they are largely ignored, dismissed, and referred to as lazy and troublemaking by most of their political leaders. This is a huge challenge. I don't have the answers, but I think this is a good one. Very quickly also, I think there are economic reflections, economic challenges with this knowledge that 60% of the population will be less than 25 years by 2015. Actually, in Niger, it will only be 15 years old. In many parts of the world, it will be underaged. 38 out of 40 of the youngest countries by 2050 will be in Africa. And that's an incredible, incredible statistic as well. How do we promote, how do we tap into the economic dividend, as some economists have talked about? How do we tap into the promotion of decent jobs? And also the fact that, when you talk about the burgeoning youthful population, often people think about migration and the migrant crisis and young people leaving the shores of Africa because of what is televised in the headlines. But actually, internal migration is actually larger. And how do we push for decent jobs for young people? How can we push for skills development and curriculum change to accommodate Africa's young, youthful, enterprising population to be able to reap more economic dividends with a young population? Finally, with an interest in environment and environmental matters and climate change, climate adaptation, you cannot move away from the urban dynamic of population growth. And I think that in urban areas, especially as a DP with our focus on the urban, in urban areas we have observed that there are trends, and the trends also show that there is a shift in growth in urban areas. How can that urban dynamic be addressed or be factored into the population growth of Africa? And how can, for instance, with my personal interest in climate change, climate adaptation, disaster risk management, become an opportunity to think about how the youth and a younger population can address some of these big challenges. The debates on loss and damage and the principle of intergenerational equity, which has seemed to drop off the agenda at COPs, haven't followed COP since COP19 in Copenhagen, where these were some of the principles which were at the headline. In 2012 in Durban, the Republic of Gambia was pushing for the argument of loss and damage for small island states, including the least developed countries, of which Africa consists of the majority. How do we bring back these ideas of loss and damage, of intergenerational equity, knowing that Africa's youngest population stands to be the one who will benefit, or to actually champion and lead that? And I think these are my reflections and comments on, I think, a good book that should be read by all. I'm wondering what the reaction of the political class has been. I'm aware that we have a Minister for Africa here in the UK. I know the former, James Dadridge, quite well. But before I could connect, he was gone, and now there's a new one who's Vicky. And I'm wondering to what extent the book has gone into those spaces, both in the UK and abroad, in the political spaces. What are some of the reactions? But yeah, thank you very much, and a wonderful book. Yeah.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you for your thoughtful response and reflections and the questions that the book raises. I think this is a good time to lead into the questions, so I will open the floor to questions.
How do we, do I speak into the microphone, or David, what do you want to do?
No, it's just,
yeah, are you sure it picks up? Okay. Hello, thank you, Ed, Rachel for sharing, and Emmanuel for fantastic comments. I think it's it's a really a fascinating, interesting. I want to get my teeth into the book at some point. Ed, I had a couple of questions, as Rachel will know, and of course Michael here will know very well because we were there together. We used to take our students to Uganda for several years, and we were hosted by the much lamented late Mutawile, who passed away last month, who was head of central bank, a fantastic economist, a huge loss for Uganda, for the continent, I think for the world. I didn't entirely agree with him, but he was a very wise man and a wonderful host. So he hosted it every time we went. And I remember asking the question about fertility, and to some extent, to what extent Uganda as a government, Museveni's, the World Bank, and all the aid agencies, including DFID, were oblivious to the fact that Uganda will eventually urbanize, and the cities were not prepared to take on this massive influx of people in cities, because the infrastructure wasn't there, the education wasn't there, the environment wasn't there, the housing wasn't there. But in expressing my concern to him about the high fertility rate in Uganda, which is, I remember it was one of the highest in the world at the time, it still is. He said, "My president is very fond of babies." And it makes me think, to what extent somebody like Museveni, and I don't claim to know anything about his psychology, but I know a little bit about his background. I mean, is there a certain machismo in all this attitude of a elderly statesman from a certain generation who prides himself in women having babies and being sort of tied to motherhood and not being sort of leading other kinds of professional lives? Is there a strong cultural element in that sort of pride for, we have more babies, we're bigger, we're going to be even bigger, and so on? So the cultural side of it, I know it's probably speculation and probably journalistic, and you may not want to go into that end. But maybe Rachel and Emmanuel can comment on it. There was a little bit in Emmanuel's what he said. The other question which Emmanuel raised is the issue of urbanization. And I think you sort of quite rightly dismiss it, Ed, as, you can't really link fertility drops or changes in fertility to one factor. But urbanization is not one factor, it's a very complex set of factors. And 40% is still very low. So, if I look at Latin America, my own region, the drops in fertility rate were huge after about 50% of urbanization rates. And the reason is women arrive as migrants into cities, they engage into a labor market which they were not able to engage in, whether it's formal or informal. Immediately they delay the date at which they start having children, and they have less children because mortality is lower. They don't have to worry about having large families, so that at least as it was in medieval times and throughout until the 20th century or early 20th century in Europe and rich countries. But also it's more expensive to have children in cities. You need to find the housing, you don't have the extended family to help you with it, and so on and so forth. So that I'm still curious as to why you dismiss urbanization outright, and I insist it's not a factor, it's a complex set of factors. I'm sorry, and a little coda to that, the links between education and fertility. You made the links between income and fertility. So in other words, you said middle class women in certain regions still have 5 or 6 or 7 kids on average. Yes, but that's not education, it's wealth. What about education? Higher education or secondary education. So is that my point?
Can I take those?
Yes, please.
If there are any more, I'll forget. I won't be capable of holding them. Well, firstly, Emmanuel, thank you very much indeed for your very good points, your considered reading of the text, and your very kind words. I am extremely touched because some of the things I felt most strongly about when writing it, given the history of what outsiders have had to say about population growth, I'm extremely gratified that I seem to have at least gone in the right direction. So that means an awful lot. Thank you. You asked about the political classes. Well, it's early days. The book has only been out since December. In this country, the Foreign Office is extremely interested in demography and has been for some years. So, I've been asked to brief them a couple of times, quite a large group on one occasion. And I know that copies of the book are moving around. Beyond that, I can't say. For me, and this may not be a popular response among development practitioners in the room, but for me, if the sort of political classes in this country and in Europe and in the West in general can just get the point about reimagining, then that for me will be something of a victory. And of course, what difference am I going to make? Not a lot, but if some people got that point, that without going down the demographic determinism route, the plain fact is that in global affairs, especially as we all sit here with these terrible things happening, in the middle of Europe, it really focuses the mind, perhaps in a way that tragedies further afield don't always. That we really, the sheer size of the continent in population terms must surely determine that a smarter take from policymakers in the West is a must. Never mind what problems the continent, individual countries face between now and then. There's going to be fundamental impacts, as I say in the book at the end, on trade patterns, on geopolitics, on the relationship of Europe with the Gulf, never mind Europe and African countries. And these things, going back again to the relative certainty of demographic projections over 20 or 30 years, here you have a tool from which you can start scenario planning that is relatively firm. I'll keep plugging away, and hopefully the message will be will reach some of the parts that other things don't. I'd also say that I will be producing a sort of summary version, which I hope will go even, and the paperback comes out in August. But I've been asked to talk to various European think tanks in Brussels and Maastricht and things. So there is at least early interest. That's outsider's view, or my take on the outside. It's a big and quite complex book. So let's face it, not many politicians are going to read it cover to cover. So I'm going to do a minister-sized version, 3,000 words for planes and that sort of thing, and we'll get those everywhere over the summer, and hope that that people start thinking more. Some of the European political tours to Africa are just an embarrassment. It's like still like going as if they're going to lower the flag. And it just it won't do anymore. It won't do for all of our benefit. And there is, of course, a problem at the prism through which nearly everyone in policy terms in Europe looks at this issue is migration. We can maybe come back to that. Africa, I start with Kwame Awino's take on this. That was quite rare that, a leading economist addressed these issues in a leading paper and sort of took on pronatalism. Will anyone listen? I don't know, but it's being published in Africa over the summer. We'll try and make copies again in paperback available, at a price that people can afford, and we'll distribute the summary version. Now, there are countries where population growth is hot-wired into government. I can tell you that from even my own experience. I mean, Egypt is one. There is a population counter above, one of the ministries, and this issue of fertility now nudging upwards again towards 3.5 from 3, is putting tens of millions on the estimated peak population. And the issue, Egypt, 90% of the population is in 7% of the landmass. Really serious issues in their judgment, not mine. And they're very vocal about it. So clearly, at a policy level, there it's hardwired in. 2012, I had lunch with 3, even before this was a twinkle in the eye, 3 ministers from Rwanda, and I'd never met before, so I sort of casually said to, what do you all think is the biggest threat to your country over the next, And they all said population. So Rwanda, partly for very obvious reasons, with 550 people per square kilometre, it is the most densely populated country in the continent. On the other hand, as I put in the book, that as population density hasn't got anything on Bangladesh. So to assume that means there's going to be another terrible problem, of strife, is not necessarily right. But they do. I know Rwandan government is controversial in some of the things it does, but it is hardwired into people. Development, the money has to go into development because of the population. And this, in the concluding remarks, which it wasn't able to get through all of mine, this is the great Nigerian demographer Alex Eze. This is his thing. People need health, they need education, they need opportunity. And I translate this in my conclusion into, this is about jobs, not bods, is how I like to think of it. The number itself is not in itself, it carries little significance. It's what that number is, that it's healthy, that he or she are educated, and that they have an opportunity. And that is what determines what the future is. And for me, as I say in the book, I think that jobs are the leading indicator here. You're not going to have the countries suddenly producing full employment, informal jobs. I mean, at the moment there's 3 million formal jobs produced a year in sub-Saharan countries, and there's about 20 million people coming on the job market. I'm probably committing a terrible solace here, but I would have thought development's about incremental, it's about nudge and small change, incremental over a long time. And if in countries where people's lives and employment and income just raise a bit over each year, then I'm not saying it'll be easy to absorb the extra numbers, but that is what you'll be looking at. If there's an increase in hopelessness, then in countries in that situation there is a real is difficulty ahead. Now, the issue of policy making and leading into Julio's raising, is this machismo? Well, I feel a bit nervous answering on behalf of a Ugandan president for obvious reasons. But I think, reading all his speeches and his early works, it's very important to realise when Museveni came to power and his cohort. This was at the height of people saying that African population growth had to be clobbered, people outside, but also people inside. Economic Commission for Africa, saying that disaster. There were 3 major reports from the World Bank in the 1980s saying that disaster was just around the corner because of factor number 1, population growth. That was something that, Museveni was educated in Dar es Salaam and under Walter Rodney, and there was a strong feeling among this cohort that the population drum was being beaten with not necessarily the best intent. And I think that remains a very strong feeling among the older generation. Of men in particular, and it's saying, and in his 2018 speech he said again, it's kind of saying whoa, or as Museveni loves saying, pole, slowly, steady. There's been a raft of family planning conferences since 2012, and there's it's as if there's a new focus on slowing population growth, and his personal feeling, obviously, is, whoa, nobody has the right to tell us, what our society should be like in population terms. And personally, I think it's quite hard not to, be fully cognizant of that. Of course, the flip side is that if everyone, if this means keeping women in a fundamentally disempowered situation and people's lives are getting worse, then something has to change. Yes, there is an element of machismo, but also politics, but also some fundamental social relations. I mean, in the Sahel countries, how do you go about changing the basic family relations? We could call it machismo, we could call it denial of women's human rights, we could call it many things, but it's very, very difficult to shift these very deep-seated cultural beliefs and attitudes. And I guess, in the spirit of the book, what I'd be saying is, this is up to the governments themselves. This is not, I know there are some, very well-meaning and skilled outsiders providing advice on this, but ultimately the decision is down to these societies and themselves. The point about urbanisation that Julio made, well, this is interesting. And the things in general in Latin America, and these are general comments, that there was perhaps a closer link with urbanisation because of the uptake of family planning. And this was done in many cases, particularly in Brazil, for example, but not in defiance of the government, but done by non-governmental bodies, women's groups, and so forth. Took this in hand and made family planning and modern contraception as a part of that more readily available. And even, despite, if we're thinking when it started, the extremely strong views, pronatalism among the sort of elites, but also the pronatalism among the Catholic Church, in Latin American countries, as Julio was alluding to, very distinctive fertility transitions were triggered with the help of family planning, but also, as he was alluding to, greater participation in the workforce and many other things. It's always a cocktail of things. In Africa, okay, Julio's saying 40% urbanization level is not a lot. Well, I agree with that, but actually, if you look at individual countries with higher urbanization than that, the link between urbanization and lower fertility, I mean, sure, fertility is always lower among women in urban settings than in rural settings, absolutely. But the extent to which urbanization is driving that, and not these other factors that Julio mentioned, it's a very complicated thing. The expense of children, the lack of family to help with childcare. It is not driving fertility downwards in the same way. In fact, I would say a lot of the dynamics are very, very different. And the nature of urbanization is... Shut up. Yeah. I'm going to. The nature of urbanization itself is very different, and I don't know enough about Latin America to comment. But I mean, you haven't got the sort of, in a classic economic sense, urbanization in Africa is in general not occurring. We're getting agglomeration of populations, but we're not seeing the classic sort of economies of scale and industrialization processes that tend to typify the, as I understand it, sort of textbook definition. So I will just stop there because
yes, thank you. I just wondered whether we've actually run out of time, but I wondered whether you want to say whether there was a question or.
There aren't online, but I had a couple of ones to ask.
Could you
Can we keep going or did they turn the lights off?
I think we can keep going for a few minutes.
Okay.
I mean,
I'd hate anyone to lose out.
Exactly.
One of my questions is you begged the question literally, in the sense you promised to talk about the exceptionalism of demographic exceptionalism of Addis Ababa if someone asked. So I'm asking. I'd just like to hear your thoughts. But the second thing is, and again, no surprise, you won't be surprised I'm asking this, but the combination of an aging governance class, leadership, and a very youthful population throughout the continent, of course with variations, means that one of the quakes that must be about to happen is a political one, where that leadership is going to die and be taken, and leadership roles will be taken over by younger, almost certainly more idealistic, less experienced politicians. And it's an open question, but it's one that has fascinated me for many years, as you know. What is that going to mean for African politics? And again, of course, there is no African politics. It's a huge, diverse continent. But there is going to be some kind of trend that I think is going to be very significant as we see that change happening in quite a short period of time. So just thoughts on that would be great. And actually, I'd love to hear you two as well if we have a few minutes for a few comments.
Sorry, I'm hogging the time.
No, it's your book. So, okay.
Well, I can do Ethiopia quite quickly because I would just say, I'd defer to Johannes Kinfu, who page 2221 in the book, but I can do it quite quickly. Extraordinarily high level of education of women in the 70s, and this is touching on the point about education, which I failed to answer as well. And rising aspirations over the period of the revolution. So it happened in that era. An uncommon dislocation from extended family to assist with childcare. And then I just read this sentence, but less significant, but paradoxically also driving fertility lower, in Kin Fu's opinion, were the endemic insecurity and violence of the time. Political tension, living in that state, frequent food shortages over the period of the revolution and after, and economic precarity that accompanied the positive developments, which were the encouragement of education and literacy among women during the Derg years.
Very different pattern in Somali
Yeah.
society, which is interesting.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. These things, I mean, there are similarly fascinating debates going on now about what's causing the situation in Egypt. Is it the fact that all these educated women have just no workplace opportunities, and so some are just going back to a sort of traditional way of life because there is no opportunity? But interestingly, the fertility's risen across the piece. This isn't just tertiarily educated women, it's rural women, poor women, rich women, urban women. The fertility is rising across every single socio-economic female category. It's fascinating. Second, younger class of politics. Well, as you know, I mean, this is, for me, the really big jigsaw. This is how the jigsaw gets put together, politics. Matthew Lockwood's emphasis on the primacy of politics. How it's jobs not bods again. How there's a future of these bods, of all these people, is going to be crucially dependent on the jobs, but on the politics as well, and what the younger generation are able to extract. To paraphrase Carlos Lopez, for example, in the way of social contracts and better social contracts and respect for diversity. This is another thing that Carlos Lopez is very big on, by which he means not diversity in the way that, Carlos Lopez was the previous executive secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa and is now one of the senior advisors to the African Union and a deeply respected thinker and a wonderful man. And his, on diversity, it's not diversity in the same way as perhaps we would interpret it here. It's respect among leaders for the diversity of their populations, so their traditions and their aspirations and their histories, and so the point he's making is the political classes are tending to play for a fairly narrow political class, and so not taking in it's the same thing as a formation of social contract, as I understand how he says it. Yeah, I have no idea how this will play out, but it's the thing I will watch magnetically. I mean, Emmanuel mentioned some of the great upheavals. But the situation in Sudan is just riveting on this front, because revolutions have come and gone without this dejection in Tunisia, for example, that maybe the goals sought in the Arab Spring have not been achieved, but other situations are very live, and I think the one thing I will say is these things are going to get more numerous, more dogged, even better organised. Women are going to become increasingly more to the fore, as they are in Sudan. So I'm happy with all of those predictions, but what they achieve, good luck to them. That's all I can say. And it's
Okay. I wanted to draw attention to the book before we close, because some viewers might be leaving us. So this is the book. I found it also, like Emmanuel, a compelling read. I'll suggest it's a must-read for any development scholar or practitioner. And it's available from Head of Zeus.
Amazon or any online, Waterstones. Yeah. I wanted to write a book that would get into the bookshops as opposed to just into libraries, and Head of Zeus have kindly provided that opportunity, and it will be out in paperback. I know hardbacks are expensive, but you can get it online for £15, and the paperback will be out by the autumn, but it is going into the libraries already as well. And if anyone just wants to leaf through, who's here, have a look at my one without the cover. Very happy to sell a copy to anyone who would like one. Well, thank you. It was written to. It's quite dense, but it was written for a general readership. Anyone who's interested in the continent. So.
Well, thank you very much. Shall I, for the purposes of people viewing, I'll draw this to a close and we'll carry on with the questions here. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you very much indeed.